You're not waking up, you're falling apart. And everything they called spiritual evolution was just a desperate attempt to escape the pain of existence. Carl Jung understood what no one has the courage to say. True awakening doesn't make you light, it shatters you. It strips away what's false, extinguishes the shine of the persona, and leaves you alone, in the dark, facing the thing you fear most, yourself. If you feel like you're losing everything, that you're going crazy while the world seems to be going well, it's not the end, it's the beginning. It's the self making its way through the rubble of its own soul. No one told you that spiritual awakening is death disguised as light, that before you vibrate high, you will crawl inside, begging to understand why nothing makes sense anymore. And perhaps it is now, at this point of exhaustion, in this silence where nothing responds, that something greater begins to be born. Because when the ego breaks, the soul speaks, and when the soul speaks, the whole world falls silent. If this is happening to you, sign up now, because here, no one will numb you with love and light. Here, we talk about the darkness that saves. There comes a time when the ground gives way, and what you called life begins to crumble. Not by chance, but because the soul has decided that the ego is no longer a safe haven. This is where spiritual awakening begins, and almost no one recognizes it. Anxiety, fear, mental confusion, loneliness, everyone interprets it as signs that something has gone wrong, when in fact it's the opposite. It's the self-opening cracks in the persona, revealing the cracks in what you believed yourself to be. Carl Jung said that individuation is a wound through which consciousness enters, and that's exactly what it is. Life, driven by a spirituality you can't control, begins to tear away what was glued together with lies, vanity, and adaptation. What hurts isn't the fall, it's realizing that the ground never existed. You begin to lose interest in what once sustained your character. Conversations sound hollow, dreams seem meaningless, and your body feels the weight of an unconscious demanding attention. The ego panics, trying to piece together the old persona, the one that pleased, that performed well in social theater. But something deeper is calling, an ancestral archetype demanding rebirth. It's spirituality calling you into your own shadow, where masks no longer serve, where control dissolves. This is why many confuse awakening with depression. Because it's a mourning for the death of what was never truly you. The unconscious begins to reveal its contents, and the self silently demands surrender. But almost no one talks about this, because selling enlightenment is easy. Living through collapse is something else. You begin to realize that everything you sought to improve was just a disguise to avoid facing your own emptiness. And then spirituality ceases to be consolation and becomes dismantling. The books, the pretty phrases, the promises of high vibration, it all sounds childish compared to the brutality of reality. This is when the soul begins to move autonomously and the ego realizes it no longer controls. And this is terrifying, because it's not about finding light, but about enduring the darkness until it speaks, until the self, tired of waiting, breaks the silence and says, "Now, enough pretending." And what comes after this fall? The plunge. This is where the descent truly begins. The plunge without guarantees, the abyss where the unconscious becomes the guide and the ego loses its map. Carl Jung called this moment the night sea journey, the nocturnal voyage of the hero who must traverse the waters of his own chaos. No mantra protects, no ritual soothes. Spirituality ceases to be a discourse and becomes psychic survival. It is the moment when the spiritual light goes out and you find yourself face to face with the darkness that dwells within you. The sensation is one of shipwreck. The self submerges the old I and forces the birth of something that has not yet taken shape. It is at this point that many retreat, trying to return to the safety of the persona. But the sea does not return those who have already been called. Individuation is a journey that requires detachment even from one's own identity. The unconscious, which you previously treated as a metaphor, begins to manifest itself in dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, and emotional breakdowns. The ego tries to resist, tries to rationally understand what's happening, but reason is useless in deep waters. The hero archetype is activated within you, but it doesn't fight with swords. It confronts memories, fears, voices, symbols that dissolve all logic. And when you try to ask for help, the world responds with silence because no one can dive for you. It's lonely, but it's in this isolation that the soul begins to breathe outside of collective conditioning. The dive isn't punishment, it's initiation. And when the bottom seems near, you realize there is no bottom at all, just increasingly dense layers of the unconscious begging for integration. You see fragments of yourself floating: pride, spiritual vanity, the fear of going mad, the desire to be saved. Everything is there, begging for a non-judgmental look. It's the point at which the seeker discovers that there is no enlightenment without darkness. Because spiritual awakening doesn't happen by rising, it happens by sinking. The self wants maturity, not escape. And the price of knowing oneself is to go through the inner hell without anesthesia. What comes after total darkness? The first figure, the shadow. It appears when you're too tired to resist, when the unconscious realizes there are no more defenses. The shadow doesn't arrive gracefully. It breaks in. Carl Jung said that what we deny within ourselves sooner or later dominates us. And that's exactly what happens. The anger you judged, the desire you repressed, the envy you hid, everything that was banished from the persona now demands return. Spirituality at this point ceases to be transcendence and becomes descent. The self wants wholeness, not purity. The frightened ego calls it a spiritual fall, but it's just what was always repressed emerging as a symptom. You begin to dream of violence, lust, and loss of control, and believe you're becoming worse, when in fact it's just becoming real. The shadow is the mirror the ego fears to look into. It's where your unlived power resides, your shelved authenticity, your ability to feel without filters. It's the place where the beast archetype meets the creator archetype. And this encounter is brutal. Most run away, return to the comfort of their nice persona, and continue living half-heartedly. But if you dare to stay, you discover that the shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to complete you. Jung discovered this when he dialogued with his own inner figures. He didn't reject them. He painted them, wrote them, gave them voice. This is what shadow work means. It's not about casting out demons. It's about listening to them. Because each of them holds a forgotten part of yourself, a fragment of power waiting to be reintegrated. But the danger here is subtle, trying to illuminate too much, too quickly. Wanting to transform shadow into light before understanding it is like burning the seed before it germinates. The shadow needs to be digested, not denied. It doesn't accept empty prayers or forced vibrations. It wants presence, the steady gaze of someone who endures their own darkness without hiding behind spiritual phrases. And this is where spiritual awakening becomes dangerous, when the ego disguises the escape as evolution. Because if you don't integrate the shadow, it dresses up as light and returns as spiritual vanity. And this is where the false master is born. The ego is a master at surviving in disguise. When it feels it's losing control, it changes its clothes and dresses up as spirituality. Carl Jung called this psychic inflation, when consciousness expands too quickly and the individual begins to confuse themselves with the divine. This is where the seeker believes they have transcended the ego, when in fact they have merely transformed it into a more sophisticated archetype, that of the enlightened one. You begin to hear the voice of the shadow saying, "Look how you've evolved. You're above them. No one understands what you understand." And this is how the ego survives, not by being defeated, but by being promoted. The old persona dies, but a new, more dangerous one is born in the name of spirituality. It's the same pride disguised as light, the same fear now cloaked in mantras. The process of individuation demands brutal honesty. The ego must not be exterminated, but relativized. It is the structure that keeps the self anchored in the world. To destroy the ego completely is to lose its shape and dissolve into madness. Jung experienced this. In his diary, he recounted the terror of feeling overwhelmed by voices and visions from the unconscious. He understood that the ego is the bridge, not the obstacle. But few understand this. They try to kill the ego as if it were an enemy and end up possessed by it even more unconsciously. The archetype of the Messiah infiltrates, "I am the chosen one, the bearer of truth." And from that moment on, awakening becomes delirium. The spiritual ego is a more polished mirror. It reflects the same narcissism, now blessed. You recognize this when you realize your quest to be special never ended. It just changed its appearance. The ego feeds on comparisons. Who is more conscious? Who vibrates higher? Who understood first? This is where the real work begins. You need to look the ego in the eye and say, "You may exist, but you're no longer in charge." An effective practice is radical self-observation, noticing without judgment each time the ego tries to hijack the self's protagonism. This isn't punishment, it's awareness training. The ego doesn't die, but learns its place. It goes from master to servant, from mask to tool. And when it finally bows to the self, emptiness is born. And from this emptiness will come the next collapse, the space between two worlds. After the ego bends and the masks fall, what remains is nothingness. Not the philosophical emptiness of books, the emptiness that aches in the body, that expands the chest and makes time seem suspended. It is the interval between the death of who you were and the birth of who does not yet exist. Carl Jung called this state the in-between worlds, the psychic limbo, where the unconscious reorganizes what remains of the old identity. This is where spirituality shows its cruelest and truest face, absence. The absence of purpose, of certainty, of emotion. It is the night after the fire, where even silence weighs. Individuation demands that you endure this disintegration without seeking crutches, without trying to create new personas to fill the hole. The self does not flourish in hasty soil. It needs silence, suspension, disorientation. Emptiness is the test that separates the seeker from the curious. Many run back to their old ego. Others take refuge in new dogmas, any belief that restores a sense of identity. But those who resist the urge to fill begin to perceive the mystery. Emptiness is not the absence of life. It is the space where life recreates itself. Jung said that the unconscious works in this darkness, gestating new psychic forms while the ego relinquishes control. And it is in this gap that the most bitter lesson emerges. You never had control. The self has always guided, silent, just waiting for the moment when the ego tires of fighting. Emptiness is the womb of the soul, dark, silent, but full of invisible power. Few can bear to remain there long enough to be born again. The body protests, the mind invents meanings, the unconscious whispers temptations. Everything tries to pull you from your center, to convince you to rebuild too quickly. But haste is a disguise for fear. The lesson here is to learn to do nothing, one of the most spiritually violent acts there is. Simply observing the nothingness, without filling it, without running away, without interpreting. When you accept the void, it begins to teach you. It shows you what is real and what was a need for control. And it is when the silence begins to speak that the outside world reacts. Because the next step of this journey is not internal, it is the clash with the unconscious world around you. Once you cross the void and begin to live from the self, the world looks at you as if you've gone mad. Return is the most dangerous stage of individuation because now you no longer belong anywhere. Carl Jung called this the problem of the returning hero, the one who descends into the unconscious, finds the treasure, and tries to share it with the tribe, only to be rejected. Deep spirituality threatens those still living in unconsciousness. Its presence becomes a mirror. It reveals what others hide. This is why the awakened are rejected not out of malice, but out of psychic defense. The collective shadow feels exposed. People close to you begin to say that you've changed, you're strange, you talk too much about yourself. What they really mean is, you broke the pact of pretense. This is the point at which the ego tries to return, disguised as guilt. You begin to feel out of place, inadequate, and try to fit back into the old mold, only to discover that you no longer fit. Individuation takes its toll. To be who you are, you must endure not being loved as you once were. Jung experienced this firsthand. After his visions and his break with Freud, he was ridiculed, isolated, treated like a lunatic. But it was in this exile that the work was born. It is so with all who truly awaken. Spirituality is not a stage for acceptance. It is a desert of authenticity. And in this desert, you learn that true love is not what accepts you, but what recognizes you even when it doesn't understand. The self doesn't seek an audience. It seeks coherence. And when the world tries to pull you back, it uses the most familiar voices. You're not the same anymore. You think you're better than everyone else. Why don't you go back to being who you were? These are the traps of mystical participation, the collective unconscious trying to restore the old balance. But the hero cannot go back. He must learn to stay awake in a world that sleeps. And this requires spiritual courage, the courage to be misunderstood, to be excluded, to walk without applause. This is where many give up, mistaking rejection for error, loneliness for failure. But true failure would be to retreat. And it is precisely in this tension that the new frequency is born, the one the body feels before the mind understands. When consciousness expands, the body pays the price. Spiritual awakening doesn't just happen in the mind. It tears the flesh, distorts sleep, and changes the heartbeat. Carl Jung called this phenomenon broken mystical participation. The moment when the individual stops vibrating in the same field as the collective unconscious and literally feels the pain of being out of step with the world. Anxiety increases, superficial conversations hurt, the noise of the city becomes deafening. It's as if the body rejects the old density and the unconscious, accustomed to merging with others, cries out for reconnection. Individuation has a biological price, the price of existing outside the mass. The self, upon emerging, changes the soul's vibration, and everything that still belongs to the old pattern begins to disintegrate. It's at this point that many seek anesthesia, medications, distractions, relationships of convenience, spiritual comforts. But the suffering of a misaligned frequency isn't something to be cured. It's something to be understood. It shows that the old energy field has died and the new is still forming. It's like a butterfly trying to breathe inside its cocoon. The archetype of metamorphosis acts within the body, and the unconscious demands silence to realign the psyche. Practices of presence, such as walking alone, writing at dawn, listening to music without lyrics, or simply breathing mindfully, help stabilize this transition. Not to eliminate discomfort, but to learn to dance with it. Pain is the sound of the old world breaking apart within you. And then comes the second impact, the return to coexistence. The self begins to reject places, people, and conversations that once seemed normal. The body feels, and this is literal, the weight of collective unconsciousness. Talking to someone superficial becomes exhausting, being in groups becomes torment, and even the silence of others seems like noise. This is when you understand that you need sacred spaces, not social ones. Jung built his tower in Bollingen for this reason. He needed a place where the soul could breathe without being contaminated by the noise of the world. The energy of individuation is delicate and only flourishes where there is truth, and it is in this call for refuge that the next step is born. The return to one's own inner tower, the refuge of the self. After the shock of the world comes the call to retreat, not as an escape, but as a vital necessity. Carl Jung built his tower in Bollingen to hear the silence of his own soul, away from noise, from the persona, from projections. He knew that the self only speaks when the ego is silent. Conscious isolation is the temple of individuation, the space where the unconscious reorganizes and the shadow finds a home. But this solitude is different from human solitude. It is an archetypal solitude. It is the self-demanding territory to manifest itself. Spirituality here is not social, it is structural, and what the world calls isolation is, in fact, the beginning of inner communion. The refuge of the self is not a house, it is a state of presence, a clearing within the unconscious where the ego finally rests from the need to justify itself. It is in this retreat that the mind learns the value of silence. The absence of stimuli begins to reveal inner voices you've never heard. The unconscious, previously buried by external noise, begins to emerge with symbols, images, memories, and intuitions. The tower is the womb of consciousness. There the self gestates the new version of being. Jung spent days carving stones, writing, cooking, simple, almost primitive tasks, but which reconnected him with his body and with the archetype of the integral human. This simplicity is true spiritual luxury. It is at this point that you realize spirituality is not a search for the high, but a return to the essential. You discover that you no longer need to be, just to be. But soon comes the temptation to return, the call of the world, the illusion that it is possible to maintain the new self and the old reality. And herein lies the paradox. The self matures in solitude, but is only completed in relationship. Therefore, refuge is not the end, it is the pause between battles. Jung called this selective participation, returning to the world with awareness of limits, of environments, of conversations that nourish and those that drain. It is not isolation, it is the management of psychic energy. The tower exists to remind us that silence is a form of wisdom, and that true spiritual strength is knowing when to leave and when to retreat. And it is precisely in balancing these opposites that the next stage is born. The union between the divine and the human. This is where awakening becomes alchemy. The war between light and shadow, spirit and matter, unconscious and ego begins to subside, not because one has conquered the other, but because you understand they were never enemies. Carl Jung called this point the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, the synthesis that only arises when the being endures tension without retreating to extremes. Spirituality ceases to be a search for purity and becomes a coexistence with the imperfect. You understand that the self doesn't want you to become good, it wants you to become whole. The shadow integrates, the ego learns its place, and the unconscious begins to cooperate. It's a strange sensation, neither peace nor war, but a serene clarity that embraces chaos. Individuation at this stage is spiritual maturity in human form. The union of opposites is the miracle that happens when you stop choosing. You realize you can be light without denying the darkness, feel fear without being dominated by it, love without needing to understand. The self is the silent orchestra that conducts this balance. The ego still exists, but now it serves. It doesn't command. The persona returns, but as a tool, not a prison. It's the reconciliation between archetypes that once fought within you, the saint and the animal, the rational and the instinctive, the creator and the destroyer. Jung said that the symbol is the result of resolved tension, and here the symbol is you, the human who carries the divine without needing to display it, the spirit that accepts the body without needing to punish it. It's spirituality descending to earth, becoming life. But this piece is fragile, dynamic, alive, because the union of opposites is not a fixed point. It is a state in constant dance. The shadow continues to emerge, the ego tries to reassert control, the unconscious brings new content. The self does not seek stability, it seeks flow. With each new cycle, an old part dies and a new consciousness rises from the ashes. This is true enlightenment, living among paradoxes without needing to resolve them. Spiritual awakening in the end is not about finding answers. It is about learning to carry questions. And it is this coexistence with mystery that prepares the final step, surrendering to symbolic death as a way to stay alive. Every true awakening ends where it should begin, in death. Not biological, but psychological, the symbolic death of the self that insists on controlling the flow of life. Carl Jung said that the privilege of a life is to become who you are, but the price of that privilege is dying to everything that impedes you. Spirituality at this point is no longer a search for light. It is a discipline of dying. The character dies, the persona dies, the certainties that kept you standing die. And from each ruin, the self collects the fragments and remakes the being, not as before, but from the inside out. Individuation reveals itself as an endless cycle of destruction and recreation, and the more you die, the more real you become. Dying is the only way to live without lies. The mind struggles, the ego despairs, the shadow tries to bargain, but the unconscious doesn't negotiate with fear. It demands total surrender. It's at this point that the soul understands there is no end, only continuous transformation. Jung called this eternal initiation because each inner death makes room for a new psychic birth. The phoenix archetype lives within each of us, burning away the old until the new remembers its existence. And living spiritually comes to mean this: dying consciously. Not running from pain, not hiding behind sugary spiritualities, but allowing the fire of truth to burn you to the bone. This is real purification, not the one that promises peace, but the one that delivers lucidity. Death is the ultimate teacher of the self, and only it teaches what it means to be free. And when you finally stop resisting, something rare happens. Life begins to pulse with simplicity again. Coffee tastes good again. The sun becomes beautiful again. Silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a temple. Because now, what lives within you is no longer the ego nor the persona, but the self, breathing through a human body. You understand that there is nothing more to achieve, because the path is the very movement of dying and being born day after day. And that is when the cycle closes and begins again, eternally. Spiritual awakening is not the end of pain, it is the beginning of consciousness. And this consciousness, alive and vulnerable, calls you to the next cycle, where death will once again be the test of love. You want to wake up, but you're still afraid of dying. And that's why you keep repeating mantras, searching for answers, feigning strength, while your unconscious just waits for the moment to shatter what's left of your illusion. Carl Jung said that the self is only born when the ego bleeds. So tell me, how many parts of you still need to die for something true to begin to live? How many selves will you still invent to avoid feeling the emptiness that calls to you? Spirituality doesn't want to improve you. It wants to strip you bare. It wants to tear you from the theater of the persona and return you to the brutality of the naked soul. And if it hurts, it's because you're close. Close to falling. Close to seeing. Close to being born. If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.